All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where he's in the art and science of games. I am Josh Blaser, and we have another great cast lined up for you tonight. We have another developer interview scheduled, and he is currently working on a new game that is kind of like roguelike inspired. And he is here to talk about that. It is Metroplex Zero, as well as some other topics as well. So please welcome Silas. How are you doing?
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Josh. It's exciting to be on with somebody so richly knowledgeable in the game design space. And I also know you're a big fan of roguelikes. So I'm
Oh, yes.
particularly interested kind of to see your thoughts about the design space and what we've been building here. And I'm really excited about our game. This has been kind of a dream game that we're creating. It's been a couple of years in the works, and it's starting to feel really incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it is great to have you on. Yeah, I've certainly have played quite a few roguelikes and lights and all that. And hey, Oscar, thanks for popping on as well. Yep, and my not even my last one, but before that was all about roguelike design and roguelikes and lights and all that. And yeah, thank you for the compliment about being for the expert of the indie dev space. Don't want to make my head too big, I guess, for the people watching, especially for my fans. I'm sure they're going to cut me down a few pegs shortly.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of the passion and dedication you've put in this space is just unparalleled. Like nobody else is diving as deep. And I think part of it's because a lot of people they try to just reflect on enough design that they can create whatever they're trying to create, but they're not focused on so much on just going deep on like the design and across so many genres too.
Hmm.
Like a lot of people have a favorite genre or two, but they're not necessarily looking at all the genres of game design and trying to learn the design lessons from each of them. So I've
Hmm.
appreciated learning from you and following your journey in that. So
Hmm.
it's not even an attempt at flattery. Like it's actually you've got some breadth in your studies of game design.
Thank you. And yeah, it is definitely a challenge. I think a lot has been like doing so much with indie games, just kind of focusing on covering them. That's been a great way to like expose yourself to a lot of different designs. I mean, there are games that I've played. Thank you, Oscar. Yeah, especially stealth racing and fighting, my three weak points of many. But yeah, like it's been a way to really been exposed to games that I probably would not have bought on my own just because of, on the consumer side. But being able to show them off and be able to play more has definitely been, I think, a really great experience in terms of learning everything there is to know about these titles.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I also think one thing that's unique about the indie game space is the fact that people can really innovate and try some very experimental ideas. And some of those work out well, some of them don't. But I think it's a place that rewards taking risks and experimenting more, which is totally different than some of the polished AAA titles that are, well, they don't break the mold too much. And
Hmm.
that creates a really interesting experience for consumers. They have to ask themselves like, am I interested in this indie experiment, because it might not be for everybody. In fact, they're much more niche,
Hmm.
but because they're willing to break the mold more, sometimes you get a much more powerful experience. I think that's
Hmm.
something that's unique about this space and exciting, but it creates more of a divide. Not It's not everything for everybody. Like Super Mario is a game that's kind of for everybody, and indie games are aiming more at their specific niche audience.
Hmm. And one of the big challenges has been, I think, trying to get more people exposed to these niches. Because there are a lot of people that I think would love the variety of indie games that, you've seen, I've seen, the audience watching like I recorded, who never have heard about them at all and may never actually hear about them. At the time that we're doing this, I'm recording my 100th indie game showcase, and I'm basically going back and watching all the videos and kind of picking out my favorite ones from that. And part of me wonders, like, am I the only one who actually covered these games? Because there are some of them that, like, I saw nothing about, like, from anyone.
Both neither from publication outlets nor like other small streamers and indie focused people.
Yeah, like they're just very small. Like maybe they got someone from like a very small YouTuber, even someone smaller than me. But then it's like maybe like 5 views or 10 views on some of these games. It's going to be kind of interesting when, like, my audience, because again, like, when I cover a lot of these games, I was maybe like 4,000 subscribers, 5,000, and I'm just wondering, like, how many people new who follow me will kind of be seeing these games for the first time, doing like this kind of second look at them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that kind of goes back to even what we've seen with the industry. Some people have talked about the indie apocalypse
Hmm.
and looking at the numbers, how many games are being released on Steam, and the numbers are like higher every year, which creates a really interesting pressure because it means there's people have to market their game well.
Hmm.
But also, if you've got to create a game that really stands out, that gets some people super excited, otherwise, like it's not going to make it with all the games that are out there. So I think that kind of makes sense. The fact that you're in that space and you're not just trying to pick from the top 10, 20%, which
Hmm.
monopolize the publication coverage,
Hmm.
means that that's probably going to be true. Like you're going to hit some that people don't end up seeing.
Yep. I kind of like make it a point to kind of downplay the games that have already succeeded and tend to focus on some of the smaller and mid-tier style games just because, for one thing, I know I'm not going to compete with a big name streamer YouTubers covering them, and two, to shine that light on some of these games that you never know, when a game is going to resonate with you or with your audience. There were a few that I just played lately. There's a game called Entity Researchers, which is kind of like a RPG, like cyberpunk Lovecraft kind of game. That it's such a like weird mix of elements that I really enjoyed it. And again, I just wonder who else is actually going to hear of this game. I tried a refactor the other night, which was kind of like a tower defense roguelike. And like you said earlier, like there is certainly a wide berth or a wide spectrum of designs in the indie space, and I think like half the challenge is really just trying to get the word out there. Because like I've said this all the time, like for every game I cover, I'm probably missing 2 to 3 dozen other games being released at the same time.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Those are kind of interesting experiments that like not a lot of there's not a lot of money being funneled into any kind of tower defense sorts of games. So you kind of can only do something like that in the indie space if you've got a cool new idea.
Mhm.
But if you create something really cool, like it would be a shame if the world didn't find out about that.
Yeah. And what's kind of interesting, because I know you're working on a deck building roguelike that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes, but the roguelike genre in particular has been one that, 15 years ago, no AAA studio would even like know what a roguelike is, let alone try to put something in there. And then over the last 5 to 10 years, with Slay the Spire, Dead Cells, Isaac, Spelunky, and so on, now we're seeing stuff like Returnal. We're seeing more like kind of roguelike or roguelite-ish elements in the AAA and AA space. And
Yes.
it's like that case again, like the indies kind of leading the charge, and then we kind of see the AAA interpretation a few years pass.
Yeah, that's true. I think one of the things that appeals to me sort of about that space is the fact that you can take a bit of content and you get sort of a non-linearly increasing amount of experience that's possible. If you play a traditionally designed game that doesn't have so many random elements, like you're kind of playing the game. You can follow a walkthrough. It's sort of the
Hmm.
same experience. You play Link to the Past, which is an amazing timeless game, and
Hmm.
you're going to have a very similar experience to somebody else. Maybe it'll be a little harder, maybe it'll be a little easier for you, but it's not going to diverge a lot. Whereas if you play some of the roguelikes, because of the procedural generation and the random elements, you might have a totally different kind of playthrough and experience and feelings than your
Hmm.
friend. You might even have totally different thoughts about the game because of those first few runs and what they taught you. And I think that's fun. That means you ended up, as a developer, it's a powerful way to create content that's almost bigger than what you made. And I
Hmm.
like that.
Yeah. Another like, but it was a perfect point here of both a game that was small and of interesting design. I've been talking with the developer of Cavity Busters, who just released their game out of early access last week. It's a dental themed bullet hell action roguelike. Like, very similar in somewhat style to The Binding of Isaac. And again, it's one of those games that I saw a few people cover it, like, very first version, and I've been keeping my eye on it since. And again, it's a game that you're not going to see like come from anybody else. And yeah, like you said with the roguelike design, like that's something I talked a lot about in the book, that I think there's still that misconception from a lot of people about kind of the pros and cons of roguelike elements. Like I know there are some gamers out there who hate, any kind of randomization or any kind of, variance in their play. They want the experience to be the same, that consistency. But you can't get that with a roguelike because that's pretty much like the complete opposite of that design.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of it is fair that people have genres they lean towards. I guess for me, having been playing games for a long time, I like that potential to have that new experience. And I think there's a lot of people who do too. Like a lot of people I know who've been gaming for a lot of years, they tend to like roguelikes more because they have a potential to surprise you or teach you something new. Whereas when you play some of the games that are more same-ish, you often already have the skills that you'd need to succeed at that, and so it doesn't have as much new to offer or challenge you.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and with those different elements, like you said, it can lead to entirely different games or different experiences, some positive, some negative. And I do wonder if like roguelike as a genre qualifier or design elements has become far more marketable today than it was 5, 7 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think based on the sales numbers, like it clearly has. I don't know exactly what to attribute that to, but it's definitely something that more people are interested in, and more people are grabbing some of the different elements because being a roguelike has at least three core dimensions that are there, and you can grab one or two or three of those,
Hmm.
and you might end up with a more interesting game because of it. So
Hmm.
it's also interesting because it's a tag that applies to those overarching concepts, but you can grab those concepts independently and end up with a totally different experience because of it.
Hmm. And like with like the whole deck building style, like one of the challenges of that I've seen is that there's so many different varieties. Some that have tried to, almost like one for one copy the Slay the Spire Monster Train formula. Some that
Yeah.
have gone in a completely different direction than that. One of my favorite games of last year was a Library of Ruina, which is like this deck
Yes.
builder visual novel. Just I can't even describe like what they did in terms of like breaking all the rules of that design. But
With dice and visual novel elements. Yeah, that was a pretty wild game.
And it's great to talk to someone who actually also plays. Because usually when I bring that game up, everyone just goes, "What did you just say? What game is that?"
I think I actually learned about it from your tweets. You were talking a lot. You were super into it last year, so I
Mm-hmm.
was like, I need to check this game out. That put
Mm-hmm.
it on my radar, and I was pretty intrigued by what they did
Mm-hmm.
and by the art style.
Oh yes. Yep. And I think the overall challenge though is that I know a lot of people who have just like really just like checked out of deck building roguelikes or just roguelikes in general just because there's just so many of them being released. And even the ones that I would argue are better than Slay the Spire in some way, shape, or form are still like not even getting close in terms of the same, coverage and airtime as Slay the Spire did. And obviously because Slay the Spire was the first game to blow up. And that's something that we've seen in just like every like major release, that the game that does it first becomes the standard by which everyone else is going to be measured by, or what they're going to go to first if they're interested in that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think Slay the Spire is kind of the king. It should inspired a lot of people, but a lot of the people who were inspired didn't end up doing something that was very new. They're just like, oh, I
Mm-hmm.
like this. I want to make something like this.
Yep.
And they didn't necessarily do the design work to create something that was a very different experience. I think Monster Train, and part of the reason they were so successful is they actually did kind of take that in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
You've got your rows and your minions, and it's very minion centric, which was not at all like Slay the Spire was. And I think that twist is why they did so well. But then there's definitely some lesser tier ones. I have played a lot of them for market research and just because
Mm-hmm.
I love card games. And some of them they didn't end up doing enough that really hooks you, so they just don't have the same replayability or depth.
Mm-hmm.
You feel like you've been there and played that, and that's a shame when a game is inspired by something and doesn't bring a new experience to the table.
Yeah. And
And that's
also,
one of my goals with Metroplex Zero. Like obviously there's a little bit of a Slay the Spire inspiration in the sense there's a little bit of roguelike element and we are playing with cards. But outside of that, I think you're going to find it's a very different kind of experience.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that always raises this very like salient point when I think about indie devs and indie game success. Is it better to have an average game, or is it better to have like a bad game where the hate watchers? Because I've played so many games, not just in the roguelike genre, but platformers and RPGs that they're good games. There's nothing bad, but there's nothing that I can put my finger on and say, wow, this game did this and it is amazing and mind blowing. And part of me always wonders like how many of those games are just like kind of they appear one day and then they're gone the next day and no one's ever heard of them.
that's a great question. I think for me as a developer, like and as an artist, I'd rather have an imperfect game that wows somebody,
Mm-hmm.
that sticks in their brain and gives them something new that they've never felt before, something new they never played before. It's because average is like that's the worst possible outcome. You don't want something that's like not bad but not good.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have an element that's great. And if you don't have an element in your game that's genuinely great, that wasn't a success. That's at least my paradigm and my design philosophy. Like I need somebody to feel this thing about this is great.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be everything, but you have to have some great elements. And if you have really great elements, you can even have rough edges and people will still love it. Some of the beloved games like actually have more rough edges than we remember because we felt so good playing them. We didn't notice some of those things, but you go back and look and you're like, oh, actually, wow,
Mm-hmm.
like, this would have bothered me now, but at the time,
Mm-hmm.
like I loved this.
Yeah, like the thing that I love about like the Elden Ring discourse right now is like people are arguing whether something is this way because the developers intended it, or because it was just a bug that was left in. And like I'm just saying, like no other developer I think could get away with that right now.
Yeah, maybe. You could be right. And I think I think it also that kind of even line of questioning betrays a lack of understanding of how game development happens. For a
Mm-hmm.
big title that's the product of a team, like there's not one developer who's like, I wanted this to be in there, or I tested this and I decided to leave this bug in. Like nobody made that call.
Yeah, and
It's just so big, and making a game is such a big endeavor, even a small game. It's such a big endeavor. It's hard to catch all the details, and a lot of things like nobody made an executive decision on. It just ended up
mm-hmm.
that way.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the reasons like for when I cover a lot of indie games that people have commented on the fact that you'll never see me yell at indie game, you'll never see me insult developers because like you just said, what obviously I know is that, developers don't set out to make bad games. This is not some master stroke five-dimensional chess of making a horrible game to rule the world. It's all about the decision making, and sometimes you can get away, or if you try X and X doesn't work out, that's a lesson learned for the future.
Yeah, yeah. I'd agree with that. I think great art takes just a lot of practice and refinement. You look at some of the master painters in the Renaissance era, and the ones who like we still talk about, Rembrandt and Picasso, and you look at how many hours of work and how many paintings they had to throw away before they became famous and successful, and it's a lot. And so one thing that's I think people miss is when you're an indie developer or developer at all, like you're still learning. The thing that you created and are selling, it might not be that deep culmination of your journey as an artist, but hopefully it's teaching you the lessons you need to create something that will stand the test of time and be, I don't know, leave a mark on gaming history. Like
Hmm.
that's kind of the vision.
Yeah, and to Oscar's comment, games to succeed need to have something distinct about them. And man, like going back to what you said about like having those rough patches or unintentional pain points, that you can find, I think, you can find a diamond in the rough, I think, with a lot of indie games. And I've played so many that I've said, like, I love this game, but I also know anyone else is going to hate it because of, X, Y, and Z. And
Yeah.
again, it's why you just never know what's going to resonate with you. Labami Corporation, the other game from Project Muta did Library Runa, there are a ton of pain
Mhm.
points in that game that can be frustrating. But again, it gets by on that unique factor that literally there's no other game like this. And I think like the war game or kind of 4X strategy genre has also kind of gone by that route because I know there's a lot of games. Either they come from Paradox or I think what's it, Slytherin maybe the publisher or developer that like these very complicated titles that have like very little in terms of onboarding approachability. But
Hmm.
the question is, of course, are you going to find this gameplay anywhere else? And the answer is no. And they've really kind of like captured that one distinct market.
Yeah, which is just a brilliant example of a good niche and a refinement in your studio of like how do you build this class of game, because you can serve a subset of the market that like they can't go to anything else and have that experience, and that delivers something that's really compelling for them. So I agree with you. Like I think that's the lack of onboarding is kind of the rough edge, that it's inherently not going to be mass market possible even if the game wasn't so cerebral because of that lack of quality onboarding. But the people who want that level of depth and that level of simulation, like nothing else comes close. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge distinctive factor. And it means they're able to effectively delight those people who love those games.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about delaying people, we kind of launched into our talk before we actually did introductions. So I definitely want to give you the chance. That's always a sign this could be a very long cast. So I'm kind of glad you gave me a soft stop point in about like 40 minutes or so, because I have a feeling we could be here for like 3 to 4 hours. But
And we can always do another one in the future. That's the cool thing. Like,
mhm.
if you have a great conversation, you want to have another one.
Yep.
That's how it feels to me.
Definitely, me too. So, for the people who are watching us live recorded right now, could you talk a little bit about who you are and kind of what your background is, and feel free to mention what your current game is as well.
Yeah, that's great. My name is Silas Reinagel. I'm the lead game designer with Enigma Dragons. We previously published a commercial title, Bit Vault, which is a very challenging mentally puzzle game that's set in a cyberpunk universe. And we've got a lot of different jam games we've created before that. We're actually going to be creating a game this weekend for LD Jam. So that'll be a lot of fun. We've got a nice team assembled, and I'm excited to see what we make. And right now, the current project we're working on is Metroplex Zero. This is one of the games I've wanted to make for quite some time, and we've been working on for over 2 years now. And it's a party-based card battler set in a cyberpunk world. It's not a deck builder in the sense that with a deck builder, every time you gain a card, you have to put it in your deck. It's a roguelike collectible game, so you can customize your deck freely as you go.
Hmm.
And the advantage of that is you are in strategic control of your outcome. If you build the wrong deck or you didn't play your deck strategy correctly, the loss is on you. It's not
Mm-hmm.
because I got this bad card in this run and it screwed up my deck composition.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that. I think that gives players a lot of agency. You don't want to feel like the game screwed you over in an unfair way. Nobody likes that. Everybody likes to feel like if I'd done that better, it would have worked out for me. And that's why I love that deck building element when I play games like Hearthstone or
Mm-hmm.
Legends of Runeterra. I like the fact that you can create your own deck and build your own play style. And I'm pretty sure the players who are going to love this game are going to have that same feeling of they like to build their deck their way and evolve it the way they want it to.
Mm-hmm. It kind of sounds like the game Deep Sky Derelicts. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
I have,
Yeah.
yes.
It's great to talk to someone who also knows like all the niche deck building style games as well that I've I've had a chance to play too. Yeah, and it's as you said, it's a kind of different feel to it compared to a Slay the Spire or a Hearthstone or a Monster Train, where the cards are kind of there to facilitate the gameplay, but it's not about kind of like the RNG of
Yeah.
a deck builder.
Yeah, that's true. Deep Sky Derelicts, I thought, was actually in a really interesting space. The one thing that didn't click for me as much was it was very long form. It's very hard to play multiple runs without consuming too many gaming hours.
Mm-hmm.
But I loved their class design. I loved the fact that you got that hub world where you're going back and upgrading in between your adventures. They did some things really nicely, and they had just a very good stylized atmosphere that makes you feel like this almost sense of like fear and dread as you're exploring these derelict ships. You're like, what dangers are around this corner? So I thought that one was really interesting from a design standpoint. I wish it had been a little more commercially successful, and I wonder if the dark atmosphere worked against them a little bit because the
Mhm.
gameplay was really good, but some people are turned off by an atmosphere that dark. So I wonder if that's part of it. And that could even be potentially a risk for our game. We're not that dark, but we are in a cyberpunk world, which is
Mhm.
inherently dystopian.
Mhm. Yeah, I wonder if like Darkest Dungeon has like similar issues with like that very dark, oppressive aesthetic to it. But there are a lot of people, and this is something I talked about with another developer. We were discussing about like difficulty and the aspects of punishment or failure. And for some people, like just the notion that you can fail is sometimes worse than the actual fail itself. It's like having the sword Damocles over your head that if at any
Hmm.
time I choose the wrong card or I go into the wrong room, all my progress is gone, my characters are dead, restart.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of exploration. Is how do you be the challenge that drives you forward, that gives you a sense of reward, like Dark Souls does. They punish you. They're like, no, you're dead.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, you got one try to recover your souls, or you also lose those. So they put a lot on the line for you. But it's also the game that rewards you. There's almost no game that has a better feeling of, I finally beat this boss, or I finally got past this really hard area.
Mm-hmm.
And if it weren't for how tough it was and how the game respects you as a player and is like, this is going to be hard, but we know you can do it,
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't have that same feeling of like victory. But there's also, like you said, there's kind of some games the setbacks too much. Like you're like, oh, I give up now. Like there's no more point in trying. Like this is too hard. Like I can't handle this, or this was too much work down the drain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's this difficult like line to cross. Like, how do you give that feeling of victory and of accomplishment without also creating that this is too tough, I can't do this.
Yeah. And I think a lot is also the length of the runs as well, or how much like weight there is. Like for me personally, I find that if a roguelike of any variety is above an hour in terms of a single run, I tend to lose interest. Because I always have this feeling that, if I just play the last 2 to 3 hours of this run and I lose, that's gone. Whereas, with something like a Monster Train, which is maybe like 40 to 50 minutes, or even like Hades, which most runs are like 30 to 40 as well, that, death just simply means, okay, move on to the next one. Like, it's a very quick, very snappy experience.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with you. I think the run length definitely is you're mentally figuring out like how much time did I invest in this run? Like
Hmm.
how bad does it feel when I lose this? And I think also it's a comfort thing. Like the more comfortable you get with the game, the faster you play. So
Hmm.
your first run of Slay the Spire, like if you succeed, like it might be longer. Like it might be a 2 hour, 2.5 hour run because you're thinking so much. As you have subsequent runs, you've pre-made some decisions. You're like, I know what this enemy does. I know I like this artifact. I don't like this card. So it gets easier. You get faster. But I totally agree with you. Like I think when a polished player can go through that run in a pretty good cycle time, like that encourages you to try more stuff, like explore more of the game, play more of the decks, try more of the synergies.
Hmm. And I think like another aspect of kind of like the whole deck building style theme again is like the number of options or the utility that you have available. Because there's some games where you if you do not get the exact build that you need for a boss, or the boss is X and you don't get Y to counter it, you lose every time. Whereas with some games, you can get just some overpowered game breaking stuff. Like, I'm sure you've obviously must have heard of Inscription by now, or you've played Inscription.
I've heard of it. I haven't played. It's on my to play list. My brother, who's the co-designer on this game, he raves about that and has loved what they did.
Yeah, like the beauty about Inscription, how much it's like a coin flip from Slay the Spire, is that Inscription breaking the game is kind of par. Like if you're not breaking the rules of the game on a course or run, then you didn't do that run right. Like we've had like crazy runs where it's like, okay, I just play all my cards. Like, okay, I win. Like it's easy to win when you can just play everything on your first turn. Or I just played the game of Castle Morihisa, which is a kind of Slay the Spire, but kind of Japanese mythology take on it. And the one run that I won was simply because through perks and cards, I basically get infinite card play. So like every turn, I'm just gonna play my entire deck. Like it's easy to win if the opponent never gets to play a card. I just go through every card every turn. And I guess to bring this back to Metro, with like your kind of your design philosophy with it, what are you like thinking in terms of strategies? Like, are you going to open up the door to kind of break the rules, or is it going to be more, I guess, restrained in that respect?
That is, man, that is a killerly good question. Um, we're kind of in an interesting space where, as designers and developers, it's hard to know exactly where it's going to end up. What we've got, one of the cool things we've got is we've got cybernetic augments that are permanent and change the way you play, and some of those do potentially have the ability to be a little game breaking. While the card design is a little bit more balanced in a traditional CCG style fashion, where those are designed like no card itself is supposed to just be like, wow, this just changes everything. Um, there's there was a card in, let's see, I'm trying to remember the name of the indie game. There was a different deck builder. Um, I'm blanking on the name, but there was a card. There's a parasite card. You could get
Mm-hmm.
it in your deck, and if you played it, it would slowly permanently convert the other cards in your deck to be a same copy of it. So when you got this and you did a run, no matter what your deck started as, it would end up as just all this one parasite card. And so it's an interesting concept, and it's fun to play
Mm-hmm.
once. But then after that, you're like, I don't want to pick that card again. I've already had this experience. That one card like totally warps the run.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's with our cards, we tried not to have things that are that game breaking. But with the augments, we're like, well, maybe you can hit a really insane combo where you get to play extra cards and do extra unfair things. And maybe that works because the odds of you seeing this, are pretty rare. Like this is an epic augment and you're not normally running this kind of deck or this kind of character in your party. So when this happens, that's a good thing. So we're
Mm-hmm.
kind of a little bit along the lines of a little bit game breaking is good, and a lot of game breaking or too intense a game break like actually ruins the immersion.
Mm-hmm. Like as you were describing, it was kind of reminding me of when I played Ring of Pain. I think that's what it was called. This like very, I guess I'm not even quite sure like how to describe the aesthetic. Like maybe like horror fantasy kind of deck builder. And the issue that I had with that, it felt like it was very hard to get a run going. And I'm sure, like for you, I'm sure for anyone out there who plays roguelikes or roguelites, like there are some games that it feels like the first 10 to 20 minutes is just all pain. Like you have very basic weapons or very basic cards, nothing is working. You are fighting tooth and nail for that one or the next upgrade. And then the second you get that, your experience skyrockets. But then with those games, what happens, of course, when you lose, you go right back down. Now, okay, enjoy the next 10 to 20 minutes of pain before, the real run begins. What was the name of that game? Teleglitch. I don't know if you've heard of that one. This was like a top-down shooter roguelike. This is like 5, 6 years ago, I think, at this point. Because I just hated that starting weapon so much. Like every time I start a new run, I was just like, "Oh, here we go again." Can I please get that a gun? Can I please just get something quick so I don't have to use this weapon anymore?
Yeah, so I think you've hit on a really good point. You want the player to be having a good time from the moment they start the run. If they aren't having a good time, like something's gone a little bit wrong in the design. That's actually part of our goal with our heroes. You have a starting deck. Each hero's got their own unique starting deck. And one of the things we've been working hard on is making sure that every character with their starting deck, like they feel good, like they've got their identity, you've got some actual powerful tools. And one thing that we found is really interesting is a lot of times, even in your late game deck, sometimes you're actually still going to like some of the starting cards. You're like, I want to run this. This card is still fantastic. This either does something different than the other cards I have, which are more specialized, or this is still relevant and I don't have something that fulfills a better role with better numbers, so I still want this.
Hmm.
And our goal is like every character should feel really good right out of the gate. And I think we've accomplished that pretty well for most of the characters. There's a couple I want to refine a little more, and we're also going to need some player feedback. Sometimes there was one character, we had a version of an assassin a bunch of builds back. And I was having a totally fine time, but some of the playtesters were like, she's so clunky. I can't like play these combos. And so we took that feedback in and we're like, yeah, okay, I can see we're playing this character differently, but this character should feel good for everybody. The basic starting deck should feel comfortable and natural no matter which style you're playing with. And so we reworked the crap out of her. Totally revamped her. And yeah, and hopefully she feels really good now.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting line with like Slay the Spire's Bounds, that what they've done with their cards, that you have like very generalized cards for each class, that they're always good. They're not bad, they're not amazing, but they're always like really solid bread and butter cards that, you know, they're just going to be good to have just because. What was it, like Iron Wave with the Ironclad that does like attack and block. And then you have cards that are very specific, or they have very unique utilities, like the Shivs with the I'm blanking on their name, that character, or
the silent.
Yeah, thank you. Or what they did with like some of the later deck archetypes or deck characters, and like those cards, they're a lot harder to work around. But if you can get like those strategies going, they're just they're going to decimate. And it's really about that challenge of what is the utility that you're trying to give the player. Because if you make every card so amazing, then there's not really any thought process. Just I play every card each turn, I win. But it goes back to that. If it's like that razor's edge of I need these exact 15 cards to show up in my deck for this run or I lose, then people are going to get annoyed. But then, of course, you'll always have that one person who's like, this game is perfectly balanced. I get those 15 cards every run. Why are you complaining?
Yeah. So one of the things that we kind of took in our design philosophy is we didn't want there to be one way to solve a problem. We wanted to create problems that have multiple solutions. Let's suppose one of the rules we have is every enemy has to do something distinct. Like they cannot just be like, I do more damage than this other enemy. All of them need to have a different play pattern and force you to like think about them and interact with them differently. So our goal is like we're going to present a puzzle. So maybe somebody they've got a couple dodge tokens, so you have to hit them multiple times to even start damaging them. And there's different ways to accomplish that. There's some classes actually have a way just to remove all dodge and like have a precise strike. They're like, no, you can't dodge this. But there's then the ordinary way of you just whack them a bunch. You spend several cards, and it doesn't feel very efficient, but you can get around it that way. But if you're going with I'm a very defensive strategy and you don't pack any damage, you're going to have a harder time with them because they're going to be scaling up and hurting you while you're like, I need a damage card. But on the other hand, you've got some enemies who are very high damage, and so using defensive cards might help you to mitigate that while eventually killing them. So we try to have at least 2 or 3 ways to deal with any mechanic and any approach an enemy is bringing to you. Because I think that means that there's an open-endedness in how you approach a given enemy encounter group.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I really liked about Monster Train, something that I talk about in my book, about having those different options, that the solution is damage, but how you get that damage can be vastly different based on, what cards you've chosen, what was it, like the rune stones or the perk things you put on cards in Monster Train. Same thing with the artifacts in Slay the Spire. And it is, I think, very important to think about these games having all those different ways of solving that. So I guess here's a question for you. With Metroplex, let's say somebody does figure out like some unbeatable, completely broken combo with your cards, like that perfect synergy. What do you do as a developer? Like, what are your thoughts process? Do you think like something like that should be nerfed, or do you leave that in? Because I've seen developers approach this in both aspects. Some leave it in, as the fun gotcha. Some change it to kind of keep the balance or keep as much of the balance as they can?
So the rule for us is, as designers, the core goal of a game is that people should have fun. And if you've got a design element that helps people to have more fun, that's good. But you can also have a scenario where you can give the player the ability to take the fun away from themselves. That's the thing that you want to avoid above all. We actually had a really interesting journey with the design for this because we tried a version called the capitalist patch. We're thinking this is a hyper-capitalist world where everything's run by money. What if we take away your pick 3 from battles for rewards at the end, and you buy everything from shops? All your cards, so we'll have shops galore, gear shops, card shops, everything. And you just get rewarded with money, and then you go to shops and buy what you want. And we had a really interesting experience with our playtesters. There were some of the playtesters, they would just sit and stockpile their money. They would go to the shop and be like, I don't like any of these 8 cards. I'm not buying them. And then they go to their next battle, and then they come back to the next shop and they're like, I don't like any of these cards. I'm not buying them. And next thing they know, they got outpowered by the enemies because they should have bought a couple cards. Even if they're not amazing, they would have made their deck more powerful. They would have had a fine time. So they're like, now the enemies destroyed me. And they're sitting on $600. Like, they could have bought some incredible cards, but they just decided they didn't like any of those cards. So we realized we gave the player too much freedom. We gave the player the ability to like hurt themselves because they thought that they shouldn't buy these cards, and they misassessed them. Like, it was definitely, we allowed them the ability to make a wrong decision and live with the consequence, but we let them make too many wrong decisions in a row, and that actually hurt their experience. So that kind of caused us to rethink, okay, maybe we can't go this hyper-capitalism route because some players aren't realizing how good these cards are because they're not picking them and playing them. If they'd picked them and played them, they'd find out, actually, this is a good card. This is totally worth the money. But they just looked at them and decided, I want something better. I want the next epic. I'm going to save all my money for an epic. And that might not come. Like, you might not get the epic you want. That's not guaranteed. Like, those are statistically rare. So I thought that was really interesting. We actually had to revisit that approach because we'd given the player the ability to do an unfun thing without knowing they were making that choice. And that's my approach to the balance. Like, I think if a player is having fun, if a player can always build the same build and play the same deck and win repeatedly, like, that's a way they could take away the fun from themselves. But if they're in a statistically rare scenario where they set, like, the stars aligned, they got an amazing build that creates a unique combo that's not easy to assemble, and that's game breaking, like, that's fine. That's fantastic. We want them to get rewarded for, I created this unique combo that nobody else can make. This feels so good. So yeah. I'd be very gentle with the nerf on that, because fun is the key thing we're aiming for. And the main thing we're trying to balance against, since this is single player and not multiplayer, is people being able to remove their own fun.
And I think that's a really great point. That kind of like decision paralysis, I think, is also an issue. And you give the player everything. As someone with over like 3,000 games in their Steam library, I feel decision paralysis like every day I load up Steam for the first time.
Yes.
And it is a really interesting point because there are players, like you said, and like I've seen them, I'm sure, when watching those, like, who will try to optimize perfectly every single time. There are people who will data mine your game. They will learn everything down to the decimal point. And at that point, it's just like, is the game fun to play anymore? Like, if you know 100% every possible outcome, every possible strategy, and you know that this one strategy is the perfect game-breaking winning one. Like, for me personally, it's why I don't like to watch a lot of guides for the games that I play. That I typically try not to play games perfectly optimized, because for me, I find that kind of boring. That I know if I get X, I win. If I don't get X, I lose. Then it's just like, why bother even trying to play that game? But at
least if it's a cerebral game. If it's an action game, it's a little different. But I think you're right. When those are thinking choices involved, you don't just want the answer handed to you, because that takes away the entire fun of the game.
It always reminds me of that article Tom Chick wrote. This was like 10 years ago about Civilization. He like coined like the Chick parabola, that the more he knew about the game, the less fun he was having. Because if you know how everything works, then there's no surprise. And again, I think that kind of gets back to why we enjoy roguelike and roguelike design so much, is that you don't know what's going to happen. You may get that ultra powerful card or item this run, or you may get nothing, and somehow that run you're going to have to make things work. When I interviewed Ed McMillan, this was like 2 years ago, about the Binding of Isaac, like one of the things he said was like he was so like sad about was that so many people they will not take items, they will purposely not take a bad item. Where he just wanted everyone to just take everything and let the chaos explode of what could happen in this run.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you say that. And I agree with you on that point about the roguelike design. I love that space for me as a game designer. And I don't think this is the only way to create games, but I want to create a game that I like to play. And you're right, that knowledge, like when you have too much knowledge about a game, it can take the fun away. One of my challenges as a game designer, and one of the reasons why this game is a bit roguelike, is because I wanted to be able to be surprised by my own creation. And with this one, I actually feel that way. It took a long time before we hit the point where the battles were fun. But once they were, every single new build we release, we have a rule that all the developers have to play at least one complete run between each development session. And every run I've been playing, I've been like having a good time and be like, hey, how can I build this deck? Ooh, this augment's amazing. Let's see what I can do with this. Can I break the game? And so the game, even though I created a lot of this content, it's surprising me with what it's handing me or what I'm experiencing because of the non-linearities. And that actually, I think, bodes well. Like, I think the fact that I'm discovering new things even as a designer who created these and having that deep knowledge means that we created a system that's capable of delivering unique experiences even to the designer. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing I like. With my previous game, Bitvault, I accomplished that in a different way. And I don't know if it's a good way, but I created puzzles that were so tough for brains that while I could remember how to solve them 1 month after creating a puzzle, once you go 2 months or 3 months, I then have to resolve it because it's actually complex enough. I can't remember the exact thinking I need to solve this correctly and get the 3 data cubes. So I ended up with a game that was fun for me, but the accidental effect was, for most people, it was actually a really hard puzzle game and maybe a little too hard. And so we actually explored a couple directions of slightly simpler puzzles. But that was the way I created that one to be fun for me. And I didn't want to create the same experience. I didn't want this to be difficulty that creates the replayability. I wanted it to be novelty. And that's what's feeling pretty good to me. And what I'd love, if this ends up being a big commercial success, what we can do with this platform is create more heroes, more cards, more enemies, more adventures. And that just causes the nonlinearity to increase exponentially. So we can end up with a game that has limitless potential in the future for expansions.
Yeah, and I think two really good points there. And to Chris's question about what is the name of the game, that is Metroplex Zero, right?
That's the one we're currently working on, and the one I referred to, the puzzle game, is Bitvault. That one's available on Steam right now, and it's an incredible experience for really smart brains who like a challenging puzzle game.
Yeah, and I think you did watch me play that one, as it caused my brain to overheat a few times during that run.
Yes, yeah. You actually are one of the most skilled players we played with, too. Oh. There were some players who they had even a harder time and were more stuck.
I am surprised by that one. I don't know, I'm sure Chad is going to refute that claim very shortly. But
yeah.
What I was going to say, like, to get back to your point about kind of the roguelike elements, and especially the expandability or the modability of these kinds of games, I think that's another really important or very major advantage of roguelike design. That you can fill roguelike games with more supplemental content, that you're not extending the length of the game, you're just extending the number of tools or things that can show up in that run. And it's why I think a lot of people really gravitate towards, what's next for a roguelike? What's going to be your next, pack or your next expansion? And what was it? One of the games I'm really looking forward to, World of Horror, which is kind of like a horror-themed Junji Ito-inspired roguelike. That there's always that space that once you kind of get the foundation or the bone structure of your game done, you can expand that, you can keep building that out for as long as people want to see it. And like the strangest thing I think would be like I know with like Slay the Spire, like I think other than adding in I think like two classes, like two official classes, like they've never done anything more. Like they don't really have an interest in supporting that game for months and years.
Yes.
Whereas I know like some developers who once they get that one game, they will support until there is literally no other idea in their head for that game.
Yes, I love that vision. In fact, that's kind of the vision that in my mind, what I think is, and there's different kinds of elegant game design, but one of the things in my mind about an elegant game design is it's a foundation of rules that enables almost an infinite play space while still resting on that foundation. I love what watched long running physical games like Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering is obviously a little bit of an inspiration for this because we're kind of in that collectible card game. It's in a roguelike shell, but you're building your collection and building your decks. And the thing that blows my mind is the core rules for Magic, they haven't changed. Like they're the same as when the game was first released. But look how many years where they release new sets and have new cycles and new competitive play. They created a foundation that is for an infinite game engine that's drawing in new players and more tournaments and more money and content that wasn't even envisioned by the particular rules. But the rules were so elegantly designed for the core game that it could support infinite expansion. And in my mind, that's I think what a good card game does is you're creating a rule set and a framework that then allows you to create infinite characters and infinite cards. And you'll still have that fun, that new metagame, that new experience without the core rules changing. And so that was something that we aimed to do with Metroplex. Like this is a card battle RPG. So it's different. It's not got the minion based combat of Magic the Gathering where you're putting on these creatures and they're fighting or you're casting spells directly at each other. This is a different framework than any other game I've played. And I even have a dream. I'd love to make a multiplayer version where players are bringing their own comps of my three heroes versus your three heroes. We both get 5,000 Metrocreds, build the best deck and augment you can, and let's fight. It would take a lot more work to develop, but I have in my mind a rule set that I hope will support a really great multiplayer game one day after people have already had fun in the world of the Metroplex Zero single player experience.
And like as you describe that, that really reminds me of back in the day of Age of Empires 3 and Command and Conquer Generals. Like Command and Conquer Generals was the one that you had the different generals and they were kind of like your deck archetypes. And they would determine, what units and resources you could have for that match.
I love Command and Conquer Generals.
Thank you. I love that one too. I still remember beating a 2v1. I was the one as the air general. And yes, I was just like...
Air general was insane.
Yeah. It's like, oh, you think you can tame those ground? Here come all the jets to bomb everything. And the reason why I love those games is that degree of customization. And I think that's always the challenge, not only in a single player, but especially in a multiplayer based game, is that when you give the player the freedom to, basically mess with your own rules and say, hey, in this RTS, I can rush now in 30 seconds because I chose these cards, and you can't do a damn thing about it. And I always think there's that pushback about that in terms of how, again, going back to what we were saying earlier, how much control does the player or should the player get when it comes to these decisions? Because if you tell the player, okay, pick 5 out of 100, they're going to pick the 5 best choices. Like, why wouldn't they pick the 5 best options? Especially if you tell them this is a competition or you're going up against somebody.
So that's true. I think one other thought I have, though, is the definition of best is driven by the game's rules and content. And in a elegant game, there's not one best. There's multiple bests, and they're contextual. So this raises the question, is the classic RPG fighter stronger than the classic RPG rogue is sneaky? And the ideal answer is no. Like, the fighter is strong, the rogue is sneaky. They're both best at that thing, but that thing is totally different and interacts in a different way. And I think that's kind of my vision is I don't want there to be one best if we've done a good job on the design. I want there to be multiple possible bests. If you like the rogue assassin, you want to be sneaky and do a lot of damage in one hit, but maybe you want to be a fire mage and just cast spells all the time, and that's your best. The goal is to deliver multiple best fantasies and make it so those like are competitive with each other. And if we've balanced well and created a branching space for that, then there's not one best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that again goes back to what we were saying a few minutes ago about creating like the novelty of these different builds. That's not about just saying what is the most. If the most important factor is damage, then obviously the deck that has the highest damage is going to win every time.
Yep.
But if you create these different abilities, if you create different ways of circumventing that, let's say one deck is about reflecting damage, or one deck is about buffing or debuffing, suddenly you don't have the best. You just have different options that can have their own, moment in the sun.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think also even with damage, there's multiple ways you can look at it. Because when you're trying to say, how do I deal the most damage? There's a way to reframe that question. Like, are you trying to deal damage to a lot of different targets with AoEs? You might have numbers that are higher if you're fighting 5 enemies, but when you're fighting 1, it's like way less damage.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want a single big damage packet? That might be nice, unless the enemy has got a dodge and you only get 1 hit. Then you did no damage, and you have to reset up for your next hit. So maybe a few smaller hits is more effective than 1 hit if they've got a lot of dodge. Or maybe they're just an ordinary big HP pool, and 1 big hit is better than having to spend multiple hits, especially maybe they got armor. So if they got armor, they're getting reduction applied to each hit. So one of the interesting things is even if damage is a solution, you can compose a problem set with good enemy design where there's not one definition of how do you deal the most damage. There might be multiple, and it might be contextual.
Mm-hmm. And how you can kind of solve these different problems or augment or change these kinds of damages or these rules is one of the major aspects of deck building or just major decision points in customization.
Yes.
Again, like with something like with Slay the Spire in particular, that you have the different classes, they have their solid archetypes. The Ironclad can do a block-based strategy. They can do a damage on them strategy. They can do a buff-based one. There is not one that you can argue that is going to win 100% of the time.
Yep.
But it's, I always equate to, the old adage, the island misfit toys, that you're just trying to make something out of all these elements. And sometimes you can get those crazy strategies. And, return to Inscription for a second. Like, one of the things I had to get kind of out of my own head is that you can't just rely on trying to get that one strategy that you like to win every single time. Because again, if you don't get that strategy, what do you do? And I think like we've said, you have to build your game to accommodate these different options. And like that's where it gets just very challenging. And then, like you said, it also opens up the door for more content. Because you're not. And I think like this is like the beauty of deck builders or card-based games in particular, is that you're not adding in content that is just flat out better. As in, I'm going to design a card that does 30 more points of damage than anything else in my game and charge people $29.99 for it. It's, I'm going to create this new rule, this new mechanic that then completely upends, what the decision making of this game is. And then that leads to more choices.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I've got these fantasies in my mind about new characters I want to create, and some of them aren't supported by the coding rules in the engine right now. But like one of the characters I'd love to create is a drone rigger, where you're like summoning drones in battle that have various effects. That would totally change the way you're approaching it. You're not just hitting them with your sword or shooting with your gun or protecting with your technology, your mass holograms. That would be you're introducing a new element, so you've got your 2 or 3 heroes plus your drones that are summoned or destroyed. That's the kind of thing that I think would be really interesting. Like, what would the game be like that when the enemies might attack your drone instead of you, and so forth? Like, that's where my mind goes with that. I'm like, hey, could I create a character that just totally reinvents the way you play that? We had a character that might not make it into the 1.0 version, but was really fun was built around money, where they could do all kinds of things. They could spend your money mid-battle to buy new cards or even buy out enemies. They could bribe a human enemy to leave mid-battle. And there were some challenges because we didn't fulfill quite the right fantasy. People who were picking them were like, no, I want to earn more money. I don't want to spend money. So they had a misconception on what the class was. They're like, I just want to make more money. Don't want to spend any of this in the battle. But it led to a really interesting space that we'd love to explore a little more in the future of, is it worth it to spend money in battle instead of more money for buying that card or that new gear upgrade? Because it's a new way to think about the problem space. And it fits in with the world lore a lot. So that's where my mind goes and what we're loving to explore as designers in this.
Yeah, and I think I may be in that same category. Like, I always hate any card that makes me, like, spend money or spend resources. Like, this is something like for people watching, they probably see me. The one kind of card that I always hate to play are the X multiplier cards. The ones that, it will be based off, X amount of energy that you spend, or, you must give up X amount of stuff and the card will respond. Because I just cannot, my mind just does not plan around that. Like, it just refuses to work around those kinds of cards.
It's interesting that you bring up X cost. We have X cost cards in our game, but they're different. So in Slay the Spire, in X cost, if you play that as your first card, that's the only card you get to play because you burned all your card plays.
Yeah.
We did a different thing where you have a number of card plays, but that's different than the resources you're using. So you might have a mage who uses mana or a commando who uses bullets. You can play a card that costs you X bullets, but that's still just one card. So you get to play two more, even if you spend all of your bullets and you're out. So X cost means a different thing even in our game. You still get to play the rest of your turn. Like, your turn's not over because you played an X cost. And that changes the thinking on it and the decision making behind when you want to play an X cost. And it gets further fun when there are some augments that reward you for having 0 resources at the end of turn. So if you did spend your bullets, maybe you get to free reload or something.
Yeah, but yeah, like we were saying earlier, like, if you're free in the future, I'd love to have you back on. I especially want to talk about puzzle design philosophy as well, because I think that's another very interesting chat.
Yeah, it is. And having made one puzzle game, I've learned a lot about that design space, and even I don't know if I'll make another puzzle game, but I have ideas for how I'd approach it if I do make another one. Because you learn a lot by being in a design space of both what to do, what clicked with people, and also like what didn't click, what would be a good thing to improve.
So, getting back to Metroplex and kind of like the roguelike or like the deck building side of things. So I guess one thing that you didn't discuss yet, I'm sure when we play the game later, we'll be able to see this, but what's kind of like the flow of the game? Like, how does a typical run play out?
That's a fantastic question. I don't fully have an answer because we've actually reworked the flow. We're on version 5 of the flow. And the current build is a gameplay only build. We're trying to finalize the cutscene writing and the cutscene bits. But we also wanted to make those optional for 2 reasons. Number 1 is some people just want to play cards and they just don't want to be bothered by a story. And that's a fair reason. And the second reason is we've got some really interesting moral dilemmas and choices in our world with our corporations and the ethical conundrums that you're facing as somebody who's trying to keep these corporations in check. And one of the things about having meaningful moral choices is remaking those choices is weird. So your first playthrough, you're like, hey, I think that as a corporation, you should be doing this instead of that. Like, what you're doing here is unethical. This would be a more ethical way to approach this. And if those are meaningful moral decisions, then when you replay the game, you're going to end up in an interesting space where either you're going to remake the same choice you already made because you still think it's morally the best, which is good but kind of boring, or you're going to choose something different just to find out what the content is, or actually just rethink, like maybe you've changed your mind, but that could create some like tension. Maybe you don't feel good about telling an AI they should kill this group of people or something. We didn't want to force people into making moral choices they didn't feel comfortable with, they weren't excited about. And And so that's why we made this. We're making the story a bit optional, but the general flow is this. We're stripping with one adventure in the early access, but our vision is we'll have different adventures with different environments. You're the same heroes, but you'll have different enemies and different environments and different villains. And in the first adventure, you're going to start to get a little bit of story. You get your first hero in your party. You're going to go through a battle, and then in between a battle, you're going to have a chance to maybe go to a shop, or maybe go to a clinic and heal up, or get a surgical implant that'll permanently upgrade your stats. Usually those are double-edged, so that's another interesting decision point. But it'll go kind of battle, story, shop, clinic, and repeat that as it gets harder and you get closer and closer to that boss fight. So that's the flow. We wanted to break it up, mostly battles, but good stuff thrown in between so you're not just always fighting. And then before each battle, you have the opportunity to scout your enemies and customize your deck. So whenever you go into a battle, you go to the deck builder screen first, and then you can either go straight into the battle, or you can mess around in your library and tweak things.
Chris S. in chat, is there a trailer coming soon for Metroplex?
Yes, soon, trademark. We actually just signed the contract with a French agency. They're going to begin work on the trailer tomorrow. So we're going to be working with them, and I don't know what the exact production schedule is, but probably within a month we'll have our early access trailer out and ready to go and ready to share. Kind of in the meantime, for people who are curious, we've got like a couple little video clips on our Twitter account for people who haven't seen the game in action, and we're trying to share those every Saturday. I can get a link to our recent one. I think I posted one last Saturday as a pinned tweet for our profile. So that's some video action. Here we go. So for people who want to see something and are interested, that's a little video clip of the game in action.
Okay. Did you put that in the YouTube chat or on the Discord?
Yes.
Okay. And then should
just
probably
put it in the.
All right. Yep, and for people watching this recorded, I'll include links to all the stuff Silas mentioned in the description down below for that version, so you'll be able to check it out like there or like that. One thing that I wanted to get back to that you mentioned earlier in the cast, that you were saying that a Metroplex has been kind of like your dream game that you wanted to do for some time. I was just wondering, like, what attracted you to this project as something that you really wanted to focus your development on?
Man, that's a great question. I don't know if there's just one thing, but kind of just a culmination of multiple directions. Like, number one, I've been a competitive card game player for years. I used to play the World of Warcraft trading card game, and I would tour. I would go around the USA, going all the different tournaments, playing at nationals, playing at world championships. That was a lot of fun, and that actually got killed by Blizzard when they went to go all in on Hearthstone. Then they revoked the license and killed the card game. I was really sad about that because I'd played a little bit of Magic the Gathering, but I loved the flow and the gameplay of World of Warcraft trading card game better. And I also liked that it had both the PvP elements and the PvE. So card games have kind of been always a thing. I think, what would it be like? How would I create a card game? Like, what would it be like? And I think that since it's something that I can connect with, I've got so much knowledge of from having played so many, and also I know it's fun, I felt like I was uniquely qualified to build a card game. The challenge is card games are very hard to build well. Like, it's not too hard to build a card game, but to build a good card game is actually really hard. So this is where I didn't want to build this as my first or second or third game. I needed just a lot more chops in game development before I started to build that. And after having done BitVault and released that one, like, I felt this was a great project to go with. Like, there's interest in the marketplace. We've seen with like Slay the Spire being successful. Like, there's clearly interest in a new type of single player card game. I've always wanted to make a card game, and I've got some of the chops to do that, and I know I can deliver a product. So that was what kind of the perfect intersection of those meant. Like, let's build this. Let's create this game.
So I guess here's a follow-up question. From like your research and from all the deck builders that you've played, like for people watching us who may be thinking about the genre or thinking about deck builders, like what do you consider to be like any like major or noticeable design traps or things that you think hurt or that you've seen some developers make a mistake when it comes to their games?
Ooh,
Because I can certainly think of a few myself.
that's tough.
Huh?
So
uh,
it's a hard question for me to answer for this reason.
mhm,
Design is kind of nonlinear, and it's I don't want to necessarily be too critical of designs that didn't quite accomplish what they
mhm.
set out to. B, like it's hmm.
It's always tough because again, one person that they don't like is another person's must-have feature, and it's the reason they play the game.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in the biggest design traps are not creating cards that present interesting enough choices. That's something that's a
Hmm.
potential very big pitfall of when in fact you see this with some of the physical card games or the digital card games is power creep,
Hmm.
where in a new set there's a card that is effectively strictly better than a card printed before, so that kind of doesn't present an interesting choice. People are just gonna be like, I take this weaker version out of my deck, I put in the stronger version.
Hmm.
So I think that's one of the dangers is just straight power creep. I think a different danger is getting too fancy and too crazy, because you can end up, there's some cards in Magic the Gathering and similar where there's like a wall of complex text and you need a judge to even figure out how to correctly interpret that card played in this scenario. So there's a danger where some designers of card games feel like the fact that I've got this text box, I can just print whatever I want and screw the players over. And I think also like we even are almost on that edge with a couple cards. We're trying to figure out like how do you make sure this is a card that's interesting while still being clearly understandable. And that's a work in the alpha and beta phase. We're actually going to polish that until we feel good about every single card, where it does something unique, but it's not hard to understand, and it doesn't do too many things. So those are a couple traps that I see: is the uninteresting power creep choices of in design, and um, the too much complexity, not distilling it enough where it's easy for players to grok what a card is, how they should play it. And it might be that you have to play it a bunch to figure out where it makes sense, but it should be grokkable and not require a judge to explain like how will this work in this scenario. If it surprises players, that's usually a sign there's something inelegant about that. And if you have too many of those inelegances, that's going to turn players off. I guess there's a kind of a third trap. This isn't necessarily exactly, well, okay. One of the things I didn't like about Slay the Spire and Monster Train, I get why they did it, but I didn't like it. They required, you can't actually play with all the cards on your first run. You have to unlock stuff. So even when
Mm.
you're playing the Ironclad, you don't get access to all the Ironclad's cards in the run. They force you to unlock them through multiple runs. And same with Monster Train. You can't even play all the factions. You can't even get all those cards until later. And that means that if you're in a fresh install, like I bought Slay the Spire for my iPhone, I couldn't continue the same experience I was having on my PC because my library didn't carry through. So I had to replay some stuff that I'd already played that style of deck with the more limited collection. I couldn't do some of the cooler things that the heroes could do. So I think there's a design trap in you might not onboard players correctly. That's a different kind of just general game trap, but not a card game specific trap. But you might keep players from accessing the content they actually need to have fun right up front. That seems like a big design mistake to me. And there's a couple early access card games that are really big. They fall prey to that sin in a big way. You get so little of the cards, you can't do anything interesting until 5, 6 runs in. That's a terrible place to be because you lose your players. Like if they weren't having fun in their first and second and third run, they're not going to come back and play your game anymore.
Yeah, and that's always that issue when you have kind of like meta progression or persistent elements. Does Metroplex have any kind of, I guess, persistent elements or unlocks or carryovers?
In the current alpha build, no, but I think we need a little bit. We're going to visit that. For example, I think we don't want to start with all the characters unlocked.
Hmm.
We want to start with maybe a pool of half or 2/3 of them, and then you get to after a couple runs, like unlock the rest of them, especially the higher complexity ones, because you might actually not have, you might not be set up for success until you've played once or twice with a couple of the characters. They're really advanced to play well. So we want a little bit, but not to be too heavy-handed, and not also the kind of free-to-play design of, come do this daily quest to get this, and come play 5 runs to get this. We don't want to over-gamify the metagame, because if the game itself is fun, people are going to have a good time and be intrinsically motivated. They don't need an external progress bar or unlockable to have that fun. Mm-hmm. So there's a delicate balance. We need a little bit, but not too much.
Mm-hmm. And I think you may have described this question earlier, but just to clarify, Chris was asking, how would you say Metroplex Zero differs from Slay the Spire in terms of like deck building rules and things like that?
So I'd love to do that in a moment. Can I answer Chris's first question about Magic the Gathering?
Sure.
Yeah, cool. So Chris in chat asked, how would you pitch your game to people who don't like Magic the Gathering? Yeah, that's a great question. This game is honestly nothing like Magic the Gathering. I was using that because it's very well known as a physical card game, and they sort of set up, they're the grandpappy of the genre of card games in general. So in this one, it's got RPG elements. You can see from, I guess I see the screenshot on the YouTube thumbnail, but it might not be up. But you've got more of a traditional JRPG style layout. So there's no hero with a life total. There's your characters who are in the world fighting. You're not fighting with minions. So in Magic, you can play creatures as well as spells and artifacts and so forth. And a lot of the combat in Magic is about putting down creatures and attacking with them. Like, it's very creature-centric. And all the games that evolved from that, Hearthstone, Legends of Runeterra, Eternal, they all are focused on this board, I'm playing creatures out of my hand or characters, and those characters are fighting for me. This is not like that. This is more like your RPG. And you have heroes who are doing things. You're shooting, you're throwing a grenade, you're casting a spell, you're shielding yourself. So it's a lot more like an RPG in the way it feels from the combat, but the cards are what it gives you the ability to do those things you're doing. And that changes like when you can do them, how often you can do them, and how wild some of the special powers are you've got. So it's radically different than Magic the Gathering. The only similarity in my mind is that it is a card game, and it's an exception-based card game, which means if you've got a card that's got some special rule on it that isn't a normal rule, whatever that card says goes. And from a question about how does this differ from Slay the Spire? Yeah, so there's, again, big differences from Slay the Spire. One of the big differences, this is party-based, as opposed to in Slay the Spire, it's just a single character. This also radically affects your deck. So we incorporate party centricity into the deck itself. With Slay the Spire, you have one deck, and it evolves as you run one card at a time as you gain those cards, and they permanently go in your deck. So your deck gets bigger and clunkier and more diluted. And in fact, one of the rewards in that game is you can get rid of cards by paying money to merchants to get them out of your deck, which is kind of a weird design element because it's saying that this card you have is a bad thing. So they punished you by giving you a card, sort of, and now they're rewarding you by letting it take it back out. And there are some of the card games that were inspired by Slay the Spire that took that even more. They put more junk in your deck. There was one where the rewards you get from beating enemies go as cards into your deck, and you have to leave the floor to even get that money to fund your meta progression. So you're punished for winning because your deck becomes less playable as you get more rewards. That seemed like a very weird design decision because you're getting gameplay punished for doing the thing the game is telling you should do. That created that just weird dissonance that didn't feel very good to players. So I didn't like any of that. We don't want to. So in our deck builder, you have a fixed size deck. If you've got one character, you've got 12 cards. When you have two characters, you've got 24 cards, 12 for each character, and they're shuffled all together into one deck. When you've got three characters, you've got 36 cards, exactly 36. You'll never have more, you'll never have less. So what this means is you're going to have a rough number of roughly the same amount of actions possible per character, unless you're doing something really clever where you're cycling cards. But in general, if you've got 24 cards and two characters, each character is going to do about half the things. some turns it'll be one character, some turns it'll be the other, some turns you do a little bit with both. But it splits it so nobody is like just the king. You need all your heroes. And also, you're not carrying on garbage. Like if you didn't want the card in your deck, like don't put it there. Put something that you like. Put the card you like best in your deck. So you can't skew your deck in ways either, or end up where I have this amazing rare, but I'm not going to draw it because now my deck's 100 cards big. That doesn't feel good. You know that if you've got an epic and you've got a 2-character party, there's a 1 in 24 chance of each card you draw being that cool epic that you just got in that you want your gameplay to be about. So you get rewarded for those high rarity cards. Your deck never gets diluted. Those are a couple of the core differences. Is you get that freedom to choose your decks, and you're not punished for gaining cards or punished for winning battles by having a clunkier deck.
All right, sounds good. And to Chris's comment, I think one other issue could be the issues I'm having with YouTube. Like between YouTube, Discord, and streaming the game and streaming everything may cause some internet hiccups. So we won't be doing that on the stream, but I will be showing the game off either later tonight or for my next indie showcase. I'm sure Sus will be around to take notes of how badly that I play it live.
That's I don't think that's what I'll be looking at. What I'll be looking at is the developer things of how badly did we communicate things or teach things, and where's the game unintuitive? Like if there's a problem in the game with the way players are playing it, it's not the players' fault. It's our fault as developers. So that's actually what we're really trying to do in this alpha and beta phase. Is we need to find out where are all the rough edges and get rid of them so that this game feels really good and is intuitive. At least as intuitive as a game with this level of complexity can be. Like that's our mission. So there's no judgment. We're just refining and trying to make this the best dang card game we can, and we're super excited to see you play it.
Right. So I guess we are about an hour and 20 in, and I think I'm just about out of questions. I do have a few logistics related stuff to go over with you, but before we get to that, with regards to Metroplex Zero, is there anything else that we didn't discuss design-wise that you would like to bring up?
So probably not. I don't think there's more we could discuss design-wise without you having played. Once you've played a bit, I think you'll have more design questions and thoughts and feelings. And that's where, as the game designer, I'm really excited to hear some of those, even critiques and criticisms. I think some indie developers are too criticism averse. There's the other side of the coin where some of the world believes that you can't have a good thing without harshly criticizing. And I think both those are wrong. What we need as developers is constructive criticism. We need to know, where did this not click for you? Because everybody's going to have a slightly different subjective feeling. And by getting more people's opinions as players, we have our own opinions on these things. And in fact, every time I have a playthrough, I always think of things that I'm not liking the way this, I didn't like the way this card worked, or this enemy, what he didn't feel very intuitive. But we are in this phase, we're really seeking out not just oh, this game is amazing, you should buy it, which I hope people feel that way. But are also looking for I didn't like the way these cards felt for this character. It didn't feel like what I wanted them to do. Because we've actually reworked heroes when they didn't feel like they did the thing we wanted them to do. Because we're trying to make sure that every single hero in this game has got a unique fantasy, and that they deliver really well on that. And if they're not clicking, if they're two archetypes aren't meshing well together, or you only like half their cards and not the other half, or what they're doing just in general is not fun or not useful, that's where we're okay, where did we miss the mark on this design? So we're really looking for that feel as well as specific thoughts, but most of these are going to be feel related things. I didn't like the way this card felt, and that's huge to us. So even when you're playing, if you've got thoughts, you don't necessarily have to be critical on stream, you can if you like, but if you've got thoughts on, hey, this sucked, tell me afterwards. I need to know it sucked because we need to make the game feel great. That's yeah. Game sucks is not useful feedback, but this card sucks, this hero sucked, I didn't like the villain. Those are actually really useful, and especially if there's a little more depth on why. I didn't like the villain because he was too wishy-washy, or I didn't like this card because it feels too weak, or I didn't like this card because it was too complex. Those are like really, those are money. Those feedback are money to us.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's that challenge, again, as you said, of being feedback adverse for a lot of indie developers. And it is tough to get feedback like this, especially if a game does, I think, good enough. I think there are some developers out there that if the game makes enough money, then surely it succeeded on all fronts and, you did everything right. But part of the challenge, and this is something that I try to focus on, is I will point out the good and the bad of all the games I play, even the ones that I love. I also talk about things that either annoy me or something that I can understand could annoy somebody else. Because I always feel like there is room to improve and to iterate on, especially when it comes to design.
I agree completely. I think, in fact, that's how you have to approach design thinking. Is you're always, when I play a game, I'm always asking myself, what are the design decisions I like in this, and what are the ones I don't like, and why? And as I think through, what really made this element great, or this element I turned me off, when I think through that and write about that, that helps my design thinking when I'm making games, because I remember that thought on that reason, and then I tie that in to my design to make sure I don't make that same mistake, or I hit the same high note. Those are king. And so that's actually one of the reasons I'm excited, especially that somebody of your caliber with design knowledge is checking out our game when it's just at the end of the alpha phase, because this isn't like a released game where, okay, now it's kind of just out there. We're actively in the deep polishing phase where what we got is playable and fun, but we actually need our players' feedback to refine that. And your design knowledge in the alpha phase is going to be huge. So I'm really, really excited to hear what design thoughts you have on which bits are clicking and what needs more evolving and what's just no good. This will be huge.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, it is getting critical feedback on a design element is huge for developers, because oftentimes they may release a game and then they'll find out about those issues. And I've seen developers who are sometimes just completely blindsided when the game goes to retail, and all of a sudden they're struck by mostly negative and 100 different reviews saying the same exact thing, and it's just how did we miss this? And again, going back to what we were saying about marketing, these are elements that in today's market of video games you cannot overlook, because even for someone like myself, just because I really like a game and I shout from rooftops, that doesn't make me a kingmaker. That doesn't mean that thousands upon hundreds of thousands of people, I wish they would watch that video, and then
maybe 2 more years and then you'll be that level.
Maybe we'll see. Chat in 2 years from now, tell me if King Josh is anything right there. But it is very hard for a lot of these games to succeed, and there's always I've seen games kind of get a second or third life a few years down the line. We had the Among Us example. But the problem, I think, for a lot of people is that they tend to struggle with understanding why a game succeeded or why a game failed. And to me, that stuff is mission critical, especially if you're trying to make your game dev into a business, that you need to know what you did right and what you did wrong.
Yeah, I'm loving what Oscar and Chris are saying in chat about developers being too close to their own creations, where they associate their work with themselves, and therefore criticism of their work with a criticism of them as a person. And I think in some ways that's kind of a sign of professional immaturity, and even artistic immaturity, because to make the best thing that you can, you need to know how people feel about it. And that means you have to be a bit outcome independent, where you're going to take it all in, and just everything, whether it's positive or negative feedback, you're just okay, this is information that lets me know how well I'm creating is resonating with people. So that attachment of the ego to the creation seems like just a kind of a lack of growth. And I'd like to hope, I don't want to be too presumptuous, but I hope I'm beyond that. In fact, I think I might swing the opposite too far. I almost encourage too much criticism of my thing, which makes me a slightly worse PR person. Because in some ways, the PR person in me should be Metroplex Zero is the greatest game ever. This is the greatest card battler. You've got to buy it. If you're missing out, you're missing out on Game of the Century. Like that's what the salesman type PR people will say. And I've on one hand, like I'm genuinely excited about this, and I've got an element to that. But I'm also very German, and I grew up in a very perfectionistic home, and so there's an element to me that's like, tell me everything you hate about my game. That's what I want to hear, so that I can make it perfect. So I try to juggle those two, and this makes me not the best PR person because I'm like criticize it, even though I also want people to love it. Like
Yeah.
that's the ultimate goal, even in the criticism. I want to create something that delights players and excites them, and that they're coming back to 10 years from now and be like, nothing's like this. I got to play Metroplex Zero.
And that's also why I'm horrible when it comes to like PR as well. That it's hard for me to just shout from the tops, look how great this thing I'm doing and all that. And it is a pain sometimes to get feedback. Like I'm trying to find feedback on
Yeah.
some of my books, and it's like, okay, here's 2 reviews. Here's a 1 out of 5 and a 5 out of 5. I'm like, great. Well, yeah, that tells me everything I need to know about what I did.
Yes. Yeah, and it's weird. It's weird. I think even the 1 5 star system has its own flaws, but like all that really means is it didn't click for one person, it did for another. But unless those people in the reviews like said why, then you can't directly derive useful information from that 1 star or 5 star. Like you need some kind of communicative content on why did they rate that way, and without that, like you can't improve the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Hello,
And
Star Dragon.
hello,
Welcome to the
Star.
stream.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to be playing Metroplex probably tonight. We may make that the first game. Well, since I know you're currently available, that way you can watch that. We did play Bitvault. This was, I think, a few years ago. But I will include links to the store pages in the recorded version for people to go to and check them out. Thank you,
Thank you.
Chris. That's great. Someday I will get somebody to leave me that critically, like, that mentally damaging review of one of my books. This is the worst design book I have ever read. Just write a small thesis paper on it. So, one of the questions that just popped into my mind, like with Bitvault being, very puzzle driven, completely different from Metroplex, which is like this deck building RPG.
Yes.
One thing that I always like to ask developers who like design like different games, what do you think? Like, do you have any ideas what your next title will be? Like, do you tend to like focus on specific genres, or is it more about when a concept resonates with you?
That is a great question. So I probably have my business answer and my more authentic personal answer. Which one do you want?
Go for the authentic.
Okay, so the authentic one, I think this one is kind of an interesting bit. Marketing is one of the hard parts of game development. And I think that with Bitvault, we created a very great game, but we did not nail the marketing bit for multiple reasons. A lot of it's inexperience. A lot of it's not understanding exactly what marketing is. And the other part is assuming you can outsource that effectively. So one of the questions that's a challenge to me is not only am I trying to build this great game, but we need to sell this game. If this game doesn't sell, like I have other businesses and I have 2 kids and I've got more, probably going to have more kids. And so I'm kind of asking the big life questions of like, how much time and effort should I put into creating games versus other things in life? So I think for this, if I'm able to if we build this game and we're able to market it successfully, then the sky's the limit. And for me, what excites me is cerebral games. Like I would not be the best action game creator, not because I don't like action games, but my unique gift in the game design space is games that help people to think and that make people think in new ways. So every game that I make, and that's what ties Bitvault with this, they're both very cerebral. So if you like to think, these are games you'll like. And if you don't like to think, these are not for you. You should go play Candy Crush Saga or Super Mario or Dark Souls. Like Dark Souls has thinking, but it's not primarily a cerebral game, and neither are those other two. So if you don't like to think, then you're not going to want to play our games. If you do like to think, ideally, these are ones that can stick with you. I really like the studio Zachtronics and what they do because they're creating those really deep cerebral experiences that are like nothing else. Nobody else can make games the way they're making them. And they make you think in totally new ways each time. So that's what I can say. When this one is commercially successful, like I'd love to build more cerebral games that help people use their brains in new ways. and in ways they didn't even know they could use them. Like that's the vision. But then the flip side of that is if we can't successfully like sell this one as well as we want, I'll probably end up spending more time doing away from games and doing more things with our other business and with my kids because those are bigger life priorities. So this is kind of a big litmus test. Like, can we get this into enough people's hands and delight enough players that we can keep making games professionally?
Mm-hmm. And it is a tough point. It's something that we talk a lot about other indie developers on our roundtable casts. It is a very hard challenge. It's a very different feel doing game dev at the business level versus doing it from the hobbyist or part time. And it is tough. It's one of the things I tell a lot of the students that I talk to in one of my library talks that it's a great industry to get into, but it is very hard, especially if you want to try and make this long term. And like the unfortunate sad part, like going back to what we were talking about in the first part of this cast today, there are a lot of indie games that I played that I loved, and those studios are no longer in business. Like they just went out. Either the studio just didn't get enough money to go forward, or they just failed out. They just decided to stop making games, and it is very difficult like that to do this for a living.
Yeah, and I think part of the thing is like you need the signal of did the market love this enough that people are like dying for more? Because if they are, like you want to keep those people happy. You found the people who love the thing. You want to keep delighting them. And it is sad when people who are able to deliver delight either are unable to do so for financial or studio or personal reasons. Like sometimes studios dissolve for maybe they sold to the wrong other studio and now they lost the essence of what made them great. Like I've seen that. Command and Conquer, I think, is a good example of a series that it had that raw energy early on, but after they sold to EA, Command and Conquer 3 was good, and then everything they've made since then like is perhaps not worth playing.
Yeah, the mobile one as well.
yeah, the mobile one is an example of an over monetized business disaster where it's nothing like the Command and Conquer that we grew up playing that was built with love and innovation. So I think it's interesting to see like even how a franchise like can die that way. You can even be monetarily successful and still die if you make the wrong call. If the same people who created the art aren't involved in it, or if the team dynamic's not the same. So that's the thing for me. Like this is a good market signal of like, do people like what I'm making? Do they want me to make more? And if the answer is yes, like I'll keep making everything. And if the answer is no, then I'll make another game when it interests me artistically. Because if I got something new to express or share with the world, that's when I'll make a new game. Like even maybe 10 years from now, I'll have lots of money because of our businesses are successful. And I'll be like, I want to make a new game. Let's build this. So I think that's the interesting thing. Games are both art and business. And that market signal of people are paying for this is a good symptom that people are loving what you're making. And the other, if you're doing it just for the art, sometimes it's still worth it because you're like, I have to. Sometimes you have that burning fire in your soul. You're like, I have to create this thing even if nobody ever sees it. Those are the two motivations. Like, and it's nice when they align because when they align, then you're kind of at that beautiful intersection of, I think the Japanese call it ikagi, where what the world wants meets what you're passionate about, meets what you're skilled at. That perfect intersection is really rare and hard to find. And everybody, I think, in their professional career is trying to find that. And most people, they'll end up with like one or two dimensions, but not all four. And I can't remember the fourth one because there's 4 in Akagi.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like my dream of what I do with game wisdom as well. Yeah, and like the chat is something about, again, like that challenge of what happened, excuse me, when you try to turn this into a business. Do you lose your way with these designs? Or you focus on something that people don't want? And like EA being a big example, we kind of see those Activision Blizzard, and again, it's that kind of like up and down of game development. And the ones that succeed, like we've said before, like if you do things all the way right, it becomes very hard for you to fail after that. Like you have to like actively go out of your way to sink your business. But unfortunately, many people will unfortunately not get that chance.
Yeah, and maybe get is the wrong term because a lot of what opportunities you have in life is based on what you take. Like
Yep.
you have to create the opportunities for yourself. If you're not walking the road, like they're never going to be there.
Hmm.
So less of that is fate than a lot of us think when we're growing up. You think, oh, you the stars have to align. You have to get lucky or know the right person. A lot of life is willpower based. Like I
Hmm.
became a game developer because I decided one day I'm a game developer. I will build games, and that became then part of my story and part of my journey, and it's been amazing.
Hmm.
But that takes that first step. I know some people who are like, I want to be a game developer, and I'm telling them, okay, so go join a game jam, make a game, and start walking that path. And they're like, well, I don't know if I'm ready to make a game, and
Hmm.
they're not going to have those opportunities until they take that step.
Hmm. Yep. And again, like going back to what we were saying about when it comes to like feedback and criticism, that there are a lot of people who they treat their games like their child.
Yeah.
And if you try, like, we've seen so many developers who will get into just some like PR like nightmares.
Mm.
How dare you criticize my game, or you're wrong, and far more worse words than I'm going to say on YouTube. And it is, again, like there's a lot that goes into game development. Like we've said, it's not just being a good game designer. You have to be able to run a project. You have to do marketing, PR, and it's why there is a difference between developers who release one game and then they just can't do it anymore versus like, again, like it seems every time we have a discussion I bring up Jake Burkett's GDC talk about being in the industry for over 15 years without
Yeah.
having a massive success.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
man, and some people only view the game industry as massive successes. That if your game isn't the next Elden Ring or the next Disco Elysium, then why bother making a game?
Which is sad because there's so many amazing games that are not in that top 10% that are fantastic and
Hmm.
world like for the people who enjoy them, those are the pivotal memories they have.
Hmm. So I think with that we're going to be hitting 2 hours very shortly, and my voice is starting to die as well. I think we can wrap things up. I guess. Oh yeah. In terms of comes to the basic logistics question. So, do you have with Metroplex Zero? Are you aiming for this to be going into early access or being released at 1.0?
So no, we're going to be going into early access, which is then we'll start to have players who can pay for the game and play the game, and then we'll use all those metrics and that feedback to evolve it into the 1.0. And also just as a marketing tool, like that's how we saw Slay the Spire work because card games are kind of a big beast. You need a lot of metrics and a lot of players before you can make just the right thing. So we're not capable of doing that until we have a big wave of players. And that's why we're going to do early access launch first, get people in, get them excited, build that community of people who are loving this game, and use that feedback to turn this into the 1.0 for the big launch. And 1.0 will be when it's done.
Okay.
So early access will be as long as it needs to be to nail this game and make it incredible.
And before we get to Chris' question, do you have an estimated date for when it will go on early access?
That's a great question. So what the Steam page I think says is like early June. Um, but I don't know exactly because we need the trailer to be out before early access, definitely,
Hmm.
and we need our story bits to be locked in. So if things go smoothly, June would be the earliest, and if it's not quite ready for early access yet, there's no need to rush this project. We got as much runway as we need, and what we care about is creating that delight and making a great experience. We're
Hmm.
not in a rush, and we're not in need of money, so we're gonna polish this until it's amazing.
And to Chris's question, do you know how much the initial price of the game will be during early access?
That is a fantastic question. Um, I don't know. We haven't decided. So I guess you'll know when it's on Steam. My thought is probably $10 or less during early access because one of the big things we're not looking for money primarily in early access. We're looking for people to discover the game and give us feedback, and that means that we don't have to charge as much because that's the key thing we want from our players is like play the game, enjoy the game, share with their friends, and tell us what we can evolve about the game. And that might mean we can even have a lower price because Yeah, the key goal for early access is not money, but players.
Mm-hmm. I guess here's one final design question for me, and like we said, like if you're free in the future after I play the game to come back on chat, I'll be more than happy to spend another few more hours with you.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Actually, to Chris, for anybody who's watching this interview in April or May, if you want to even get in before early access into the alpha, we're totally happy to bring you in for free. Again, what we're looking for is players to start playing and giving us feedback. So if you want to jump in early and get a Steam key, just reach out to me. Yeah, message me on Twitter or Discord, and we will get you in. You can start playing the game right away and giving us your feedback and telling us how can we make this game exactly what you want it to be. That's my vision. So
All right, so my final design question for tonight, then I want to talk to you about one of the other aspects that we've been talking about again, like 1.0 and beyond, with like expansions, additional content, more rules, etc. Another question I'd like to ask developers who work on cerebral games like this, where you have these very, I guess, like compartmentalized mechanics and rules with the different cards, different characters, etc. How do you decide, or like, what's your thought process on what's going to be in 1.0 versus what will be beyond 1.0? That, let's say, everything goes well, the game succeeds, you now have a lot of eyes on it, and you want to expand on it. What do you keep for that content versus what must be in 1.0 for you?
so to answer the question of what's beyond 1.0, I don't think we can make a good answer to that yet, because what it comes down to is what the community wants. If the community is like, we need more adventures, we need more heroes, that's an easy path forward. If they're like, this is amazing, I want to fight my friends, that's a sign maybe we need to build a multiplayer mode or a multiplayer game based on the rule set. Pardon me. So that's the thing, is I can't say exactly what's after 1.0 because it just really depends on what the player base wants. That's what we want to build. Like, we've got ideas, tons of ideas, but the players are going to help us steer towards what they actually want, because we don't want to put a ton of effort into the wrong thing. One thing that we've done is we've got actually some short stories that are set in the Metroplex universe, and a couple those are available on Patreon. If you're a patron, you can read those short stories, including by Queen of Cyberpunk writing, Anna Mosakat. She's known for like Beyond Blue Eyes, so she wrote a short story for our world. So that's the kind of thing that's it's part of our world, but it's not the game itself. If our players are loving our world and like want to read more of those, like, let's make more stories too, and put them in the game and make the game more story centric. If players are like, no, we like the cards, we don't care about the story, we don't care about the moral choices, then that's also like really useful feedback of, okay, let's just get more gameplay in here. So that's the thing. We need to see what's like clicking with people, like which parts of this big vision resonate most with people, to know what's after 1.0, because it's open. That's an open question, and we've got a ton of directions we can take it. This thing can go as big as people want it to go. So if people are excited, then we need to see what it is they want, and we'll build that. We've got a ton of ideas in that space, but we need at least a little bit of direction hint to know which way should we invest our energies and money.
All right, sounds good. So, I guess two final questions for you, Silas, and then I will let you go for tonight. So, the first one is, if you have any social media you would like to plug. Oh, I see Chris posted a question. We'll get to that after this. But do you have any social media you like people to mention? Plug anything. Anything like that. Oh,
So Twitter's the one that's the most active at the moment. We're looking into others, but they're either very time costly for us. They take away from our development time if we spend more time on social, or money costly if we're paying people who actually like. It's hard to find gamers who also do social media management, because that would be the ideal person, somebody who plays the game and enjoys it. So Twitter's the best place if you want to follow and see regular updates. Every screenshot Saturday, we're aiming for putting up something new of like what we're adding into the game as it's moving towards that early access release and towards the 1.0 release. That's probably the key one.
Okay. And I guess to end on, do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans or anyone watching to kind of, tie our cast up in a nice big bow with?
I just want to say it's been like really incredible answering these questions and thinking through some of the design elements that you're considering and wrestling with. Like I said at the start, you're really one of the foremost experts in indie game design. And so just talking through this is not only fun but educational. I am It helps me to ask and think about the right things as a business manager for the project and also as lead game designer. So I've learned a lot just even in this call, and I've got new things to think about and new lenses to look at my game with as we're in that polishing phase. So I just want to say thank you. Like, this has been incredible, an amazing interview.
Thank you. And yeah, like for the chat, let me know again if the how proficient I am in puzzle games, stealth games, and fighting games in the future, or again, if I will become the kingmaker of indie games in the next 2 to 3 years. We'll see what happens there. But yeah, Silas, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you tonight. Thank you again for reaching out to come on. And like I said, if you are free in the future, I am always happy to have you back on.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to our next time together.
All right. So, for the people watching us live or recorded, we're going to end things here for tonight. If you are enjoying things live and want to see Metroplex Zero here on the stream, I'll be playing it for the Indie Showcase, which we are wrapping this up at around 9:30 my time. So, I'm going to fill up drinks, rest my voice for a few minutes. We'll be back around 10 p.m. ET, and we will start the Indie Showcase then. And be sure to do all the liking, subscribing, commenting. If you want to follow me on Twitter, Discord, Patreon, there are links up there in the corner if I am pointing my finger right. And if you are a developer and want to come on for a future stream, cast, let me look at your game, or just chat game design, please reach out. There are all the different ways available, and I am always happy to chat with you. So, Silas, I'm sure I will be seeing you in the chat in the next few minutes, taking a lot of notes as I play the game. But again, thank you so much for coming on, and yeah, we will certainly chat again in the future.
Thanks so much to the kind viewers who've been entertaining questions and sharing their thoughts in chat too.
All right. So with that said, everybody, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, whereas they are on science of games. Until our next chat, take care.